Eight Eyes, originally released in 1988 for the Famicom and then in 1990 for the North American NES. It's a game that at first glance many retro gamers will just call it a Castlevania ripoff. However, the game is more than that. It's a personal favorite of mine, but the only question remains, is Eight Eyes worth playing today? Eight Eyes would be the second to last game released by developer Thinking Rabbit. They would go on to release one last game for the Super Famicom a few years later on. The story of Eight Eyes is one of the things I love about the game is it's set in a post-apocalyptic future. You play as Orin, a falconer, along with his trusty falcon Cuttress, with the task of traveling to real-world locations and retrieving the Eight Eyes. These are 8 jewels that were found at the bottom of 8 nuclear bombs that have gone off to destroy the world. It's thought that if the 8 jewels are brought back together and put on the pedestal of peace, that, well, peace can truly return to the world. Each of these 8 eyes, of course, have a guardian that is trying to prevent you from getting a hold of them. Your goal is to defeat them in battle, get them onto your side, and thus retrieve their jewel. The game does look a lot like Castlevania, but it plays a little bit like Mega Man, in the sense that your weapon is only great against one boss in particular. When you defeat a boss, you'll get a new, more powerful weapon, and your goal is to figure out the order that you need to defeat each of the enemies so you have the best chance of being able to best them. This is one aspect that is mentioned in the manual, but unfortunately not mentioned anywhere in the game itself, so many gamers probably wouldn't have even realized that that's what you're supposed to do in the game. The game features 8 levels, with 7 of them being named directly after real-world locations, and the 8th one named after the final boss. The 7 levels based on locations are Arabia, Spain, India, Africa, Germany, Italy, Egypt, and then finally the final level of the game known as House of Ruth, not to be confused with the non-profit organization. Each level in Eight Eyes is filled with crazy architecture, maze-like elements that will end up confusing many gamers the first time around, as well as plenty of mutated messes for enemies that are going to try to stop you. If you are able to make it to the boss of a level, if you end up dying, unfortunately it's back to the level selection screen, and you have to start the level over again from the beginning. What makes the game so difficult and why many gamers aren't going to like Eight Eyes is the fact of the combat. You have a small rapier as your main weapon. It has an extremely short range, and getting used to this of being able to take out enemies usually takes a while if you ever end up getting the hang of it. For the most part in the game, the biggest strategy is delivering a hit to an enemy, backing away, and then returning once they get done with their attack pattern. If you try to attack most enemies in the game head-on by just standing directly in front of them and keep attacking, you're just going to end up finding yourself getting hit over and over again, draining a lot of your precious health. However, one of the best aspects about the game is Cuttress the Falcon. You can actually play the game 1 or 2 player, and if you play in 2-player mode, somebody takes full control of Cuttress while the other one controls Orin. However, if you're playing in single-player mode, you control both of the characters, though it's a little bit more limited as far as the overall control of Cuttress you have, but it still works perfectly fine. You'll have to send Cuttress off of your shoulder in order to then dive bomb attack many of the enemies in the game. Some enemies can only be defeated by getting hit by Cuttress, which can be annoying, but once you figure out which enemies they are, and there's not that many of them, it becomes pretty easy to do so. Every time you defeat an enemy in the game though, they will end up dropping a cross, either a small one or a big one. It's funny that these even made it into the game due to Nintendo's strict religious policies at the time, but the white crosses will end up refilling your item meter, whereas the brown crosses will actually refill some of your health. Well, the health of whichever character picks it up. If you pick it up as Cuttress, it will actually refill his health. Yep, the Falcon has his own health bar, and unfortunately can die. The item bar can be used for your sub-weapons in the game. Obviously, once again similar to Castlevania, but there are some unique ones here. You have a boomerang, the power ball, which is basically a sphere that flies out and does a wave-like pattern across the screen, taking out some of the enemies. There's the dagger, which of course just throws a straight dagger out at enemies. The Molotov cocktail, which works kind of like holy water in Castlevania, where you throw it on the ground and causes a little flame. There's a gun, yes, an actual gun, though it ends up being one of the worst sub-weapons in the game as it seemingly doesn't do a whole lot of damage. And finally, the most important of the sub-weapons, the Icefall. This will freeze enemies in place for a little bit of time, giving you the opportunity to land several hits in a row. having the Icefall going into a boss at the end of a level will be one of the easiest ways to take them out. One of the cool aspects is you can actually have more than one sub-weapon at a time. Press and select to quickly switch between the ones you've gathered, as well as you can pause the game and select one manually. Unfortunately though, when you gather sub-weapons and you end up either dying or completing a level, you lose them all and you have to regather them in the next level. Thankfully every level though has the snowball. Your item meter and health meters, represented at the top of the screen by the rectangles that are linked together, can actually be increased. You can find them in each level to increase it either by one rectangle or max it out to the max amount of health and item. Another one of the negative aspects though is if you die or you go to the next level, you lose any of the upgrades you ended up getting. Another part that will frustrate a lot of gamers is the end. If you're able to actually beat the game and make it to the very end of the game, you then make it to the pedestal piece, where instead of just getting an ending, you actually have to put the jewels in the right places on the pedestal. The game gives you no indication on the screen of where to put the 8 eyes, though the game does have clues within it. Every level that you go to has a scroll located in it. If you're able to find it, it will give you a clue on the placement of the jewels at the end. You have to find all of these, and then you can kind of write them down and piece together the order that the jewels are supposed to go into. Thankfully, if you're on the level selection screen, you can press the select button in order to bring up all the clues that you found thus far. So once you get the scroll for the first time, you can bring it back up and reread them if you need to do so. I just wish you could do that at the end of the game when you're at the pedestal. Only little plus side is they do give you a password once you defeat the final boss for the pedestal a piece segment of the game. So if for some reason you can't figure out the order, you at least will have a password to take you right to that part, so you can kind of go back to one of your previous passwords or play the game up until you figure out the order and then go back to that spot. Now let's talk about the levels themselves. I will have a little bit of spoiler here that I'm going to put them in the order that you're supposed to complete them in, so if you don't want to know the order you're supposed to beat the game in, you may want to skip ahead a little bit. First up though is Spain. This level is a great introductory level because it's going to teach you a lot of what this game is about, and if you play Spain and hate it to the point that you just don't want to play the game anymore, there's no sense in trying any of the other levels. All you do in Spain is literally go up a large amount of staircases to the very top of a tower and then down the other side, eventually making it to the boss. Along the way, you'll have a few different styles of enemies that you can kind of get used to, the whole hitting, backing away, and then coming back forward to deliver more hits. There's enemies in the levels that can only be taken out by Cuttress, and most of the sub-weapons are introduced here and are easy to get a hold of. The way you get them in the game is by defeating a certain enemy on each level. Instead of dropping a cross, they're instead going to drop one of the sub-weapons if they have it. It's always on the same enemy every single time, so once you play the game a little bit, you'll know which ones drop the sub-weapons that you want. If you can make it to the boss, you'll be battling off with Enriquez Bartona, holder of the Black Pearl known as the Black Butterfly of Parishashu. This is a great introductory boss. He's relatively straightforward with 3 different styles of attacks with his sword. He also moves relatively slowly compared to some of the other bosses that we're going to have to deal with, and since he doesn't teleport or jump around, it's a good opportunity for you to hit and back away and get used to that whole mechanic. A lot of the bosses in the game also contain power-ups within their layers, so be on the lookout for these as well, including invincibility potions as well as health regeneration. One little strategy you can always use though is Cuttress. By having him out and then climbing up the platform at the end of the area, you can use Cuttress to kind of attack the boss, dealing at least a decent amount of damage before dropping down and trying to take him out yourself. The best thing though in 8 Eyes by far is when you defeat a boss. You actually get to sit down and have tea with them. Here you get your password and see what new powerful weapon you got, but you actually get to enjoy a nice cup of tea brought to you by a skeleton waiter who will actually refill it a couple of times, and it's just one of the awesome moments of this game and one of the things that truly stands out about it. Next up is Egypt, and this is a lot tougher of a level than Spain. In the stage, you are also introduced to a lot of the door mechanics for the first time. At the beginning of each level, there is a switch that you'll have to hit in order to enter the first door to get into the level. But most stages in the game will also have other doors like this throughout them, where you'll have to hit a switch and quickly get to a door. If you don't do so in time, the door will close and you'll have to hit the switch again. A lot of times you'll have to use Cuttress to help you out, hit the switch, and then quickly get to the door, though thankfully Cuttress will then join you before you transition to that next room. Egypt has a very stone look to it, and is one of the more dull looking levels overall, though I do like the waterfall and water in the level itself. If you're able to make it to the end of the stage though, you're going to be battling Nari Thanatos. This old wizard-like guy is one of the tougher bosses in the game for sure, and he's the holder of a ruby known as the Blood of Tutankhamun. He jumps all around the room, pausing only to fire out projectiles directly at you, being really hard to dodge. The projectiles do go in a more sporadic pattern every time he fires them, so he may not necessarily hit you directly head-on with them. You can use Cutlass as a distraction. The only issue is, every time he ends up doing those different projectiles, he may potentially jump, and when he does jump, he's going to go towards either you or Cutlass, whoever he's focused on. So sometimes he can end up jumping on the platform near the very beginning of the level, and you'll have to wait for him to come back down towards you. Thankfully, if you have snowballs going into the fight, it's a doable battle, but if you beat Nari, you'll be able to beat pretty much every boss in the game. Next up is Italy, one of my personal favorites of the game, mostly due to the boss at the end of it. The level, once again, thankfully, is pretty straightforward, just trying to make your way through it. You are introduced to one of the weirdest types of enemies in this stage, and that are these guys that hit you with their chains, and it looks like they're wearing a diaper. I've at least always thought they were wearing a diaper, and unfortunately you can only end up taking them out using Cutlass. There's not a ton of these guys in the game, but they're just one of the weirder enemies overall. If you are able to make it to the end of the level though, you're going to have to battle Gino Camicho. He has a green emerald known as the Princess of Frenelia. Now, what's cool about Gino is he uses cards as his weapon, and he has a pet panther, which sounds awesome, but ends up making for a really tough fight. The panther, and hitting it, doesn't count towards his health bar. The panther will jump around the room even though it's contained within a small area at the beginning of the level. He can easily get up to where you are and become a nuisance. You can take out the panther, but by the time you're able to do so, you probably are going to lose all your health from Gino. Gino likes to throw a set of cards in your direction and then immediately backtrack in the opposite direction of you, making it tough to actually track him down. You can destroy the cards in mid-flight though, so if you time it just right, you can destroy his projectiles as they're coming your way. Overall, I've always thought though Gino was one of the cooler bosses. Next up is India. While I like the color scheme and some of the architecture in the level itself, it's not anything too special, at least as far as this game's concerned. If you make it to the end, you'll have to battle Cipher Nazim, a holder of the yellow obsidian known as the Wing of Angels. Cipher has the ability to teleport. He'll walk slowly towards you, firing out projectiles, these giant fireball-like ones, and then he'll disappear. He'll reappear randomly somewhere else in the area, usually close by to you. If you're able to time it, you can actually quickly get behind him and deliver some hits as soon as he ends up appearing. This is a relatively easy fight, and thankfully there's even a double damage potion located in his boss arena. So if you're able to grab that, plus have the best weapon, you'll be doing 4 times damage, and Cipher doesn't have a chance. The next 2 levels are the maze levels of the game, and first up is Africa. I've always liked the Stone Age kind of orange look to everything in the stage, but the maze is very difficult if you don't know how to solve it. Basically, the very beginning of the level, you'll be able to go down into a pit and then have to manipulate the stairs and the hole located on that screen, and if you do things just right, you'll be able to get through. The level's actually extremely short once you figure out the actual right way to get through the maze. If you're able to make it through though, you'll have to battle King Amin. He has an orange topaz known as the Devil of Zimbabwe. Now this guy is a pretty heavy hitter. He throws axes in your direction and it can hit a long distance. It's really hard to judge and it's completely random what trajectory he's going to end up using for his axes. And since you're trying to run up and get close to him, it can be difficult to do so when he's throwing all these axes towards you. One little tip is he actually does less damage than his axes, so if you're gonna get hit at all, get hit by the body of King Amin. It won't do quite as much damage as the axes he's trying to throw out at you. Next up is the other maze level in Germany. This is a bigger level and the maze isn't quite as difficult. Basically, it's just a disjointed mess where each of the entrances, staircases, pits just take you to another random spot in the level itself, so things don't end up adding up the way they should in the level. By a bunch of trial and error, you'll probably be able to figure your way through it, and if you're able to do so, you'll end up battling Walter Schmidt. He has a purple amethyst known as the Fairy of Granada. Now, he has another projectile-like weapon that you thankfully can destroy as well. It's basically these boomerang-like blades that will end up coming out 2 at a time. You can actually corner him in the far left side of his area, and if you're able to do so, you will be able to deliver a decent amount of hits, though this fight can still be rather difficult. The 7th of the main levels is Arabia. I love the color scheme here and a lot of the design overall. It's pretty crazy, but thankfully it's not a maze like the last couple of levels we had to deal with. When you make it to the end of the stage, you'll have to deal with Gadi Rashal, who has a diamond known as the Tear of the Nile. Now, for this boss, he has two different styles of weapon. He has a straight-up scimitar that he'll try to swing at you in a couple of different patterns, as well as he can throw knives straight at you. Using Cutlass as a nice distraction can cause him to kind of turn around and swing the opposite way, allowing you to hit him multiple times in a row. He also deals out a lot of damage with his weapon, making the battle tough, but if you're able to persevere, it's onwards to the final level of the game. Last but not least is the House of Ruth. This level is a boss rush, featuring most of the bosses from the game, including the final boss at the end. Each room is just a battle against an individual boss, though you have the full maximum health and full maximum item at the end of each of the bosses. So once you defeat a boss, all of this ends up refilling, giving you a great opportunity to take out the bosses. The only issue is you don't have the best weapon to take them out, so you're only doing the standard damage. But you also have all sub-weapons, so you can use that Icefall to your advantage, and every one of the boss chambers during the boss rush has a full health and item replenishment located in it, so that you can end up having that to make sure you're able to finish each fight off. One interesting note that even though the last level of the game is a boss rush, one of the bosses, Walter Schmidt of Germany, doesn't end up making an appearance. Either way, when you do make it to the end of the level, you have to battle Ruth herself. Ruth Grenier, who is the holder of the blue diamond known as the Nail of Nightmares. She's an awesome final boss, has a bull skull on her head, and uses a bull whip to try to attack you. It has a good reach and can be difficult to actually get in hits if you're trying to get close to her because of the range of the whip. Cutlass once again is a great distraction for helping you, and once Ruth is defeated, you make it to that pedestal piece, putting in the right order of the jewels, and you can enjoy the ending. If you are able to complete the game, you get a password for the harder difficulty, and in fact, there's even another difficulty after that if you want to try to tackle it. The game increases the speed of the enemies you have to deal with, making things a lot tougher to get through. Besides the tea drinking, one of the other best aspects of 8 Eyes is the soundtrack. It's extremely underrated. I hear almost no one ever really talk about the music of 8 Eyes, though if you decide not to even mess with this game and you like retro soundtracks, you need to give the soundtrack of 8 Eyes a listen. The game features 3 different tracks for each of the levels, giving a pretty diverse overall feel to it. The music overall has some great melodies throughout the course of it, and I just wish there was even more music in the game because it's that well done. The composer for the game was Kenzo Kamai, who unfortunately only composed this and one other title. In fact, doing the research for this video, I found out he actually did compose one other soundtrack. It was for Sokoban Perfect, a compilation of Sokoban games that we would get here in North America for Game Boy as Boxel and Boxel 2, but those games together are known as Sokoban Perfect, and he did the music for that, which if you're able to find that soundtrack, it's also a great listen. We all have those games that most gamers end up not liking or critics pan, but for some reason we end up gravitating towards, and that's the case with me in 8 Eyes. I've played the game an absolute ton over the years, though it's hard to recommend it. It's not a hidden gem or a masterpiece by any means. Learning the actual combat is pretty difficult, and the game can be a chore at times to actually get through. However, it does have a fantastic underrated 8-bit soundtrack, so if nothing else from this video, if somebody out there goes and listens to the music for the very first time, then I say this video was well worth putting together. But anyway guys, that's gonna wrap up this retro review for 8 Eyes. I'd like to thank you for watching, and of course I hope you enjoyed.